That morning, no one expected a single act of defiance to change military history. What began as routine training became a moment every soldier on base would remember, and one that would test the difference between following orders and doing what's right. The cold Hereford rain fell in a steady drizzle, turning the gravel paths of Stirling lines into a slick mosaic of mud and stone. It was just after 600 hours, and the camp stirred with the familiar rhythm of a British Army base, awakening to another day of disciplined routine. Lance Corporal Elena Hargrove moved through the grey light with the quiet efficiency expected of her rank, her boots leaving faint impressions in the damp earth as she made her way to the drill square. At 28, she was one of the few women in her unit, assigned to administrative duties within the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment's support cadre, a role that kept her on the periphery, handling logistics and paperwork, rather than the high-stakes operations that defined the regiment. The air carried the sharp tang of wet concrete and polished leather, mingling with the distant lowing of cattle from the surrounding Herefordshire countryside. Stirling Lines, the SAS's secretive home at Credenhill, was a place of controlled intensity, where every movement was measured, every word clipped and purposeful. Soldiers from various regiments rotated through for joint exercises, but the core of the base pulsed with the unspoken ethos of the SAS. Who dares wins, delivered not in bravado but in the steady gaze of men who had stared down worse than rain. Elena adjusted the strap of her Bergen, the weight of her kit a familiar anchor against the chill seeping through her combat jacket. She had joined the army at 18, rising through the ranks with a competence that spoke louder than any boast. Yet here, in this bastion of elite soldiery, she was often dismissed, a support bird, as some of the lads called it behind her back. Her slight frame and reserved manner didn't help. She spoke little, observed much, her dark hair pulled back tightly under her beret, her eyes scanning the horizon like a sentry on watch. As she approached the muster point, the parade square came into view, its surface already gleaming under a thin film of water. Sergeant Major Wilkins, a broad-shouldered veteran with a face etched by years of desert deployments, barked orders from the edge of the formation. "Fall in, smartly now. We've got a full day of weapons familiarization ahead." His voice cut through the patter of rain, authoritative yet devoid of theatrics, the kind of tone that brooked no argument in the rigid hierarchy of British military life. The unit assembled in precise lines, privates at the front, lance corporals like Elena a step behind, sergeants overseeing from the flanks. Across from them stood a detachment from the Mercian Regiment, guests for the week's cross-training exercise. Captain Rhys Harlan led them, a tall officer in his mid-30s, with the polished demeanour of Sandhurst, his uniform impeccable despite the weather. He nodded curtly to Wilkins, the two men exchanging a brief salute that spoke of mutual respect earned in shared hardships. "Right, lads, and ladies," Harlan said, his Welsh lilt softening the edges of his command. "We'll be integrating for the range work. Keep it tight. No slacking in this lot." His eyes swept the formation, lingering a fraction longer on Eleanor, though whether in assessment or dismissal she couldn't tell. She stood at attention, shoulders squared, her posture betraying nothing of the quiet resolve that had carried her through basic training and beyond. The morning briefing unfolded with mechanical precision. Wilkins outlined the schedule. Equipment checks in the armory, followed by live-fire drills on the range. "Any questions?" he asked, his gaze challenging the ranks. Silence fell, broken only by the drip of rain from the eaves of the nearby barracks. Elena felt the subtle shift as eyes flicked her way. Private Jenkins, a fresh-faced recruit with a smirk that never quite faded, nudged his mate beside him. She ignored it, focusing instead on the horizon, where the Brecon beacons loomed faintly through the mist. As the formation broke to collect gear, Elena moved toward the quartermaster's store, her steps measured against the echoing boots of those around her. The store was a squat brick building, its interior lit by harsh fluorescence that cast long shadows over racks of rifles and crates of ammunition. Corporal Tate, the storeman, handed out the SA-80s with gruff efficiency. "Hargrove?" he grunted as she approached, sliding a weapon across the counter without meeting her eyes. "Mind you don't scratch it. These aren't toys for the typing pool." She took the rifle, checking its action with practiced hands, bolt smooth, sights aligned, before slinging it over her shoulder. No retort escaped her lips. Words were ammunition best saved for necessity. But as she turned to leave, Captain Harlan entered, flanked by 2 of his Mercians. He was discussing the range layout, his voice low and precise. "We'll need the full complement for the assault course simulation. Ensure your team's up to speed." Elena paused to let them pass, stepping aside into the narrow corridor. Harlan's path brought him close, and in the confined space his arm brushed hers. A minor collision unavoidable in the press. He glanced down, irritation flickering across his features. "Step aside, girl," he ordered, the words sharp but not unkind, the casual diminutive slipping out as it often did in the male-dominated ranks. She complied without hesitation, flattening against the wall, her expression unchanging. But in that moment something shifted, a faint crease in her brow gone as quickly as the rain's patter on the window. Harlan continued on, oblivious, his focus already elsewhere. Tate watched from the counter, a faint chuckle escaping him as he turned back to his ledger. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming on the tin roof of the store. Eleanor emerged into the downpour, water beading on her rifle barrel as she rejoined the formation. The crack in discipline was subtle, a hairline fracture in the day's routine. Not the order itself, but the undercurrent it revealed. The quiet underestimation that had shadowed her for years. She wiped a droplet from her cheek, her gaze steady on the drill square ahead. The training was set to begin, and with it, the unyielding march of military life. Yet beneath the surface, in the reserved silence of her thoughts, Elena Hargrove carried the weight of a past that no one here suspected, a history forged in shadows far deeper than Hereford's morning mist. The unit moved out toward the range, boots striking the wet path in unison, the air thick with the scent of oiled metal and damp wool. Wilkins led the way, his presence a bulwark against the weather. Elena fell in step, her mind turning inward, the exchange in the store already filed away like a classified dossier. In the regiment, silence was both shield and strategy. It was how one endured, observed, and when the moment demanded, acted. As the first shots echoed faintly from the distant butts, the bass settled into its rhythm. No one could have foreseen how this ordinary morning, laced with its small injustices, would unravel the threads of assumption and reveal the steel beneath. For now, though, it was just another drill under the relentless British sky. The range at Stirling Lines stretched out like a scarred canvas under the persistent drizzle, its butts and firing points etched into the rolling Herefordshire hills. By 0730 hours, the unit had settled into the methodical cadence of weapons familiarization, the air humming with the sharp reports of SA-80s discharging in controlled bursts. Lance Corporal Elena Hargrove positioned herself at Lane 3, her rifle cradled with the unhurried precision of long habit. She adjusted her ear defenders, the padded weight a familiar barrier against the world, and sighted down the barrel at the distant targets, silhouettes that blurred slightly in the mist. Sergeant Major Wilkins prowled the line, his boots sinking into the sodden turf as he inspected each soldier's stance. "Cheek well, Jenkins. Get it right or you'll be cleaning the butts till tea time," he snapped at the private, who straightened hastily, his face flushing under the sergeant's glare. Wilkins was the embodiment of the regiment's unyielding standards, a man whose career spanned tours in Helmand and the Balkans, his voice a gravelly anchor in the hierarchy that bound them all. Privates like Jenkins deferred to lance corporals such as Elena, who in turn answered to sergeants and beyond, up to the majors who orchestrated from the observation post. It was a chain forged in discipline, where rank dictated not just orders, but the very rhythm of breath during a ceasefire. Elena fired her grouping, 5 rounds, each one punching the paper with mechanical accuracy. She worked the bolt with fluid efficiency, her movements economical, betraying none of the fatigue from the early muster. To her left, Corporal Tate, the storeman from earlier, paused in his own drill to glance her way. "Not bad for desk duty," he muttered, just loud enough to carry over the wind, his tone laced with that familiar undercurrent of condescension. A few of the Mercians chuckled softly, their laughter muffled by the rain pattering on their helmets. Eleanor didn't flinch. She reloaded without a word, her focus narrowing to the iron sights. Competence was her retort, silent and irrefutable. The morning wore on under the leaden sky, the cold seeping through layers of wool and Gore-Tex until fingers stiffened on triggers. At 0900, Wilkins called a halt for equipment checks, the formation breaking into smaller groups around the firing points. Eleanor knelt to clear her weapon, disassembling it with practiced hands. Barrel detached. Bolt carrier wiped down with a cloth that came away smeared with residue and rain. Private Ellis, a lanky recruit from the Mercians, wandered over, ostensibly to borrow a cleaning rod but lingering with a smirk. "You lot in support must get bored, eh? All that filing while we're out here getting our hands dirty." She met his gaze briefly, her eyes steady and unblinking, before handing over the rod without comment. Ellis took it, his expression faltering slightly under her quiet scrutiny, but he pressed on, nudging Tate for affirmation. The corporal obliged with a grunt. "Aye, Hargrove's our tea lady half the time. Keeps the ledgers straight at least." The jibe hung in the damp air, drawing nods from a couple of nearby privates. In the rigid order of base life, such barbs were as routine as roll call, dismissals that reinforced the lines of rank and roll, especially for someone like Elena, whose administrative posting kept her from the front lines of selection or ops. By midday, the unit trudged back toward the heart of Sterling lines, the promise of the mess hall drawing them through the downpour. The path wound past the squat barracks blocks, their brick facades streaked with moisture, and the faint outline of the officers' mess in the distance. Elena fell in with the lance corporal's file, her Bergen slung low, the weight of spent casings in her pouch a tangible reminder of the morning's labor. The air grew heavier with the scent of wet earth and boiled cabbage wafting from the cookhouse, a staple of British Army fare that no amount of rain could dilute. Inside the mess hall, a long, low-ceilinged space with formica tables and the perpetual hum of fluorescent lights, the routine asserted itself anew. Soldiers queued in orderly fashion, trays clattering softly as they loaded up with shepherd's pie, peas, and mugs of strong tea. Eleanor joined the line behind Sergeant Wilkins, who nodded curtly in greeting, a rare acknowledgement that spoke volumes in its brevity. "Solid grouping this morning, Hargrove," he said, his voice pitched low, as if praise were a commodity too precious for volume. She inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, Sergeant Major." At the serving hatch, the mess corporal ladled portions with mechanical impartiality, the steam rising like fog from the vats. Elena balanced her tray, navigating the crowded benches where ranks mingled but never blurred, privates at one end, non-coms in the middle, officers at their separate tables. She chose a spot near the window, overlooking the parade square where puddles pooled under the grey light. As she ate, methodically forking the pie, Captain Harlan entered with his Mercian detachment, his presence drawing the room's subtle attention. He scanned the hall, his eyes passing over her without pause, before directing his men to a table nearby. The conversation around her was the clipped patter of military life, talk of kit shortages, the upcoming inspection by the base commander, a major from the intelligence corps, and murmurs about the joint exercise's demands. Private Jenkins, seated 2 benches away, leaned to his mate. "See Hargrove over there? Bet she couldn't hit a barn door without a map." Laughter rippled, subdued but pointed, the kind that thrived in the mess hall's confines. Elena sipped her tea, the hot liquid grounding her against the chill that lingered in her bones. She observed it all, the hierarchies etched in seating, the unspoken codes of deference, her posture unchanging, a study in reserved endurance. After the meal, the afternoon schedule beckoned, a full kit inspection back on the drill square, the unit reassembled under Wilkins's watchful eye, the rain easing to a fine mist that beaded on berets and rifle slings. Elena stood in line, her webbing laid out impeccably, pouches aligned, boots polished to a dull gleam despite the weather. The sergeant major moved down the ranks, prodding at fastenings and checking for contraband. When he reached her, he paused, running a gloved finger along the seam of her Bergen. "Immaculate as always," he murmured, the approval implicit in his nod. Across the square, Captain Harlan observed from the sidelines, arms folded, his expression neutral. As the inspection concluded, the base settled into its deeper rhythms, The distant thump of a helicopter on approach, the low murmur of briefings in the ops room. Elena shouldered her kit, falling in for the march to the training sheds. The mockery from the mess lingered like the damp in her jacket, a subtle erosion against her silent competence. Yet in the ordered world of Sterling lines, such tests were part of the fabric, the quiet forge that shaped soldiers, rank by rank, under the unyielding British sky. No one spoke of it aloud. It was simply the way of things, carried forward in the steady tramp of boots on wet gravel. The afternoon training sheds at Sterling lines loomed like squat sentinels against the Herefordshire hills, their corrugated roofs slick with the remnants of the morning's rain. By 1400 hours, the unit had filed inside, the air thick with the scent of oiled machinery and damp canvas. Lance Corporal Elena Hargrove moved with the others toward the assault course simulation area, a labyrinth of mock obstacles and low barriers designed to test endurance under simulated pressure. The space was dimly lit by overhead strips, casting long shadows that danced with the shuffle of boots on the concrete floor. Sergeant Major Wilkins stood at the entrance, clipboard in hand, his presence a quiet command that stilled the low murmur of conversation. "Right, we'll run through close-quarters drills in pairs," Wilkins announced, his voice even and precise, cutting through the hum without raising in pitch. "Focus on transitions, weapon handling under duress, no complacency. This isn't a stroll in the park." The ranks divided efficiently, privates paired with lance corporals, sergeants overseeing from the flanks. Eleanor found herself matched with Private Ellis from the Mercians, the same lanky recruit who'd needled her earlier at the range. He shot her a sidelong glance as they took position at the start of the course, his smirk barely concealed under the brim of his helmet. The drill began with mechanical rhythm. Elena led the first run, navigating the barriers with fluid economy, dropping low behind a stack of sandbags, transitioning her SA-80 from slung to ready in a seamless motion. Ellis followed, his movements heavier, boots scraping unnecessarily on the gravel scatter. "Keep up," she said quietly as they reset, her tone neutral, an instruction rather than a challenge. He nodded, but as they approached the next obstacle, a narrow crawl under barbed wire netting, his pace faltered deliberately, forcing her to adjust mid-stride. Wilkins observed from the periphery, his eyes sharp, but his expression impassive, the embodiment of the regiment's understated scrutiny. Captain Harlan had joined the session, leaning against a support beam with his arms crossed, his Mercian detachment arrayed nearby. The air held a subtle tension, the kind that built in confined spaces where hierarchies pressed close, officers at a remove, non-coms bridging the gap, and the lower ranks grinding through the routine that separated the capable from the rest. On the third iteration, the violation came swift and unbidden. As Elena cleared a low wall, vaulting it with controlled power, Ellis reached the top behind her. In the press of the moment, or so it would seem, his hand shot out, grabbing her sleeve at the wrist in a firm tug that yanked her off balance. She stumbled slightly, her boot catching on the edge, and in the split second of disruption her Bergen snagged on a protruding bolt. The weight shifted, and with a muffled clatter, her cleaning kit pouch spilled open, tools and spare rounds scattering across the concrete like accusations laid bare. The shed fell into a hush, broken only by the echo of the spill. Ellis straightened, feigning surprise, his hand withdrawing as if burned. "Sorry, Lance Corporal. Slipped my mind you were up front." The words carried just enough innocence to mask the intent, a staged failure that drew chuckles from the Mercians clustered nearby. Corporal Tate, watching from the sidelines, let out a low snort. "Careful there, Hargrove. Can't have the support lot tripping over their own feet." The laughter spread, subdued but pointed, rippling through the privates like a fault line in the formation. Private Jenkins joined in, his voice pitched for the group. "Maybe stick to the ledgers next time. Less chance of dropping the lot." Elena knelt without a word, her movements deliberate as she gathered the scattered items, a bore brush here, a pull-through there, each piece retrieved with the same quiet precision she'd shown on the range. Her wrist throbbed faintly from the grab, the fabric of her sleeve twisted where Ellis's fingers had gripped. But she betrayed nothing, no sharp intake of breath, no accusatory glance. She simply righted the pouch, secured it to her webbing, and rose to her feet, posture unbroken, eyes fixed forward, as if the incident were a minor variance in the drill, not the humiliation it was meant to be. Wilkins stepped closer, his boots echoing softly on the floor. "Reset and continue," he ordered, his gaze sweeping the pair without favoritism, though a flicker of assessment lingered on Ellis. The sergeant major's intervention was minimal, as was the way in British ranks, discipline enforced through example, not spectacle. Harlan observed from his post, his brow creasing slightly, but he said nothing, turning instead to murmur instructions to one of his lieutenants. The hierarchy held firm. A lance corporal's stumble, even provoked, was hers to absorb in silence, the chain of command a bulwark against chaos. The drill resumed, Eleanor leading the next run with undiminished focus, her transitions sharper now, as if the spill had honed rather than dulled her edge. Ellis lagged again, but the barbs had done their work. Whispers followed them through the course, the air heavy with the undercurrent of dismissal. In the regiment's world, where operations turned on unspoken trust, such public disrespect was a subtle erosion, a test of resolve amid the rigid order of base life. Elena felt it settle in her chest, a quiet weight like the rain-soaked chill that clung to her jacket. But she pressed on, her silence a shield forged in years of similar shadows. As the session wound down, the unit dispersed toward the equipment racks, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like distant rotors. Elena slung her rifle, wiping a smudge from the stock with her thumb, her mind cataloguing the moment. The grip, the spill, the laughter that echoed the long underestimation of her role. Outside, the mist had thickened, veiling the parade square in a soft grey. She emerged into it alone for a moment, the cold air grounding her against the warmth of resentment she refused to voice. In Sterling lines, endurance was the unspoken creed. Injustices like this were born in the steady march forward, observed but unremarked, until the rhythm of duty demanded otherwise. The evening muster loomed with its roll call and final briefings, the base settling into the hush of dusk. No one lingered on the incident overtly. It was folded into the day's ledger, another thread in the fabric of military restraint. Yet for Elena it lingered like the scent of wet concrete, a reminder of the fractures beneath the surface. She adjusted her beret, falling in with the formation, as boots struck the path in unison, the quiet tension of the afternoon carrying forward into the unyielding British dusk. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far stories of courage and integrity can reach. The first hints of evening settled over Sterling lines like a drawn curtain, the Herefordshire sky deepening to a bruised indigo as the unit dispersed from the assault course sheds. Lance Corporal Elena Hargrove made her way back to the barracks block, her boots leaving faint tracks in the softening mud of the path. The air had cooled further, carrying the earthy scent of sodden grass and the faint, acrid tang of gun oil from the day's drills. Her wrist still bore a subtle ache from Ellis's grip, a reminder etched in the faint red mark beneath her sleeve. But she moved with the same measured stride, her Bergen slung low and secure. In the regiment's world, discomfort was a private matter, absorbed into the rhythm of routine like the persistent drizzle that beaded on her collar. The barracks were a utilitarian sprawl of low brick buildings, their windows glowing with the warm flicker of mess lamps against the encroaching dusk. Eleanor entered the non-coms wing, the door creaking softly on its hinges, and deposited her kit on the bunk with economical care. The space was sparse, iron frames, olive drab blankets, and the low hum of a radiator fighting the chill. She peeled off her damp jacket, rolling her shoulders to ease the tension, and caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin, dark eyes steady, jaw set in quiet resolve. The spilled kit from the shed lingered in her mind, not as outrage but as another layer in the underestimation that defined her days here. She washed her hands under the cold tap, the water stinging her skin, and prepared for the evening muster. Outside, the parade square had emptied, save for the distant silhouettes of sentries pacing their posts. Sergeant Major Wilkins conducted the final roll call from the muster point, his voice a clipped anchor in the fading light. "Hargrove." She responded with a sharp, "Here, Sergeant Major," falling into line with the others as the formation tightened. Captain Harlan's Mercians mingled at the edges, their presence a temporary ripple in the base's ordered flow. The briefing was brief. Tomorrow's joint exercise on the breaching range, with emphasis on team integration. Wilkins's eyes swept the ranks, lingering a fraction on Elena, but he offered no comment. His nod the extent of acknowledgement in the hierarchy that valued deeds over discourse. As the unit was dismissed, a low rumble echoed from the west, the distinctive thump of Chinook rotors slicing through the mist. Heads turned instinctively toward the helipad, where a dark shape materialized against the hills, a helicopter touching down with practiced grace, its downwash scattering leaves and grit across the gravel. From the formation's fringe, whispers stirred. "That's the lads from Hereford proper. Selection cadre by the look." The arriving unit was a small detachment from the SAS's main selection process, rotating in for oversight on the cross-training. They disembarked silently, figures in subdued camouflage emerging like shadows, their movements fluid and unhurried, betraying none of the fatigue from whatever classified circuit they'd just completed. Leading them was Major Alistair Kane, a wiry officer in his early 40s, his face weathered by operations that remained unspoken even among the regiment. Kane's reputation preceded him in hushed tones, a veteran of counter-terrorism raids in shadowed corners of the world, his beret bearing the winged dagger that marked true belonging. He exchanged a curt salute with Wilkins, the two men standing at ease as if old acquaintances in a quiet pub rather than on a windswept pad. No fanfare, no barked greetings, just the subtle alignment of postures that spoke of shared history. Kane's team, 4 operators in all, fanned out with minimal gear, their eyes scanning the base not with curiosity but assessment, the stillness of predators at rest. Eleanor lingered at the edge of the dispersing formation, adjusting her beret against the rotor wash that tugged at its brim. As she turned toward the cookhouse for a late tea, her path converged with the newcomers. One of Kane's men, a sergeant with a faint scar tracing his jawline, brushed past her in the narrow approach to the path, their shoulders nearly colliding in the dim light. He paused, stepping aside with a fractional nod, his gaze meeting hers for a beat longer than protocol demanded. In that instant, something flickered in his expression, not recognition but a subtle curiosity, drawn to the way she held herself, shoulders squared, chin level, the quiet economy of someone who had navigated worse than a crowded helipad. Kane observed from a distance, his arms folded loosely, the very picture of reserved authority. As Elena continued on, he fell into step a few paces behind, conversing lowly with Wilkins about the exercise parameters. "Your support cadre holding up?" Kane asked, his voice even, carrying the soft burr of a Scottish border accent tempered by years in the south. Wilkins grunted affirmatively. "Solid enough. Hargrove there. Keeps the logs straight. Doesn't complain." Kane's eyes drifted to her retreating figure, noting the precise fall of her boots on the gravel, the absence of unnecessary sway in her stride. It was a small detail, but in the regiment such things were tells, the unhurried competence that marked those who had endured selection's crucible, even if peripherally. Inside the cookhouse, the evening shift had thinned the queue, the air warm with the residue of stew and fresh-baked bread. Elena collected her mug of tea, strong, no milk, and found a bench near the rear, away from the clusters of privates trading stories of the day's drills. The Mercians had claimed a table by the door, Ellis and Jenkins among them, their laughter subdued now in the presence of the newcomers. Kane and his team entered shortly after, opting for the officer's corner but accepting mugs from the same hatch. As Kane stirred his tea, his gaze swept the room methodically, pausing on Elena. She felt it like a cool draft, the weight of observation from someone who saw beyond ranks and roles. One of Kane's operators, a lance corporal named Reed with close-cropped hair and steady hands, moved to refill his mug and passed her table. As he did, Elena shifted slightly to make space, her sleeve riding up just enough to reveal a faint ink mark on her inner forearm. A small, stylized dagger, half concealed by the cuff's edge. Reed's step faltered imperceptibly, his eyes locking on the tattoo for a split second before flicking to her face. It was a mark known only to those who had passed through the regiment's veiled trials, a remnant of a classified attachment years prior, when she'd been pulled from standard duties for an intelligence support role in a high-risk op. No words passed. He simply nodded once, deeply, and continued to the hatch, his posture shifting to one of quiet deference. Kane noticed the exchange from across the room, his spoon pausing mid-stir. He said nothing, but a subtle tension eased in his frame, replaced by the stillness of understanding. Wilkins, catching the shift, raised an eyebrow but held his tongue. The unspoken code of the SAS demanded discretion, revelations earned through action, not announcement. Elena sipped her tea, the hot liquid steadying her pulse, aware of the invisible threads now drawing taut. The mockery from the afternoon seemed distant in this moment, overshadowed by the arriving observers' silent scrutiny. In the warm confines of the cookhouse, amid the clink of mugs and low murmur of voices, the base's rhythms continued unbroken. But for Elena, the air held a new undercurrent, the quiet prelude to observation, where hints of a hidden past began to surface like ripples on still water. As the detachment settled in for the night, Kane lingered at the door. Watching the square where lamps cast pools of light on the wet stone, Wilkins joined him briefly. "Good lads you've brought," the sergeant major said. Kane's response was a measured nod. "They see what needs seeing." Outside, the mist thickened, veiling the hills, and Elena emerged into it, her path taking her past the helipad where the Chinook's blades hung silent. The evening's hush enveloped Sterling lines, the rigid hierarchy holding firm, but beneath it the observers had arrived, their stillness a promise of the reckonings yet to come. The morning sun struggled through the persistent overcast, casting a muted pallor over the breaching range at Sterling lines. By 800 hours, the joint exercise had assembled the full unit on the dew-slicked gravel, the air crisp with the scent of damp heather and machine oil from the mock doors and charges laid out for the drill. Lance Corporal Eleanor Hargrove stood in the formation's mid-ranks, her posture aligned with the others, rifle at the slope, her expression as impassive as the low hills encircling the site. The night's subtle exchanges in the cookhouse lingered in her thoughts like a half-remembered briefing, but she pushed them aside, focusing on the task. A simulated entry under timed pressure, integrating the Mercians with the SAS support cadre. Sergeant Major Wilkins directed the setup with his customary precision, dividing the group into assault teams of 4, 2 from each unit. Overseen by non-coms. "Entry on my mark," he called, his voice carrying clearly over the faint rustle of wind through the barriers. "Clear the room, secure the objective, no deviations." Captain Harlan positioned his Mercians at the fore, Ellis and Jenkins among them, their banter subdued in the presence of the SAS detachment. Major Kane and his team observed from the elevated control point a wooden platform ringed by sandbags, their figures still and watchful, berets casting shadows over eyes that missed nothing. Elena's team formed up at the third breach point, paired with Private Ellis once more, alongside a Mercian corporal and under Corporal Tate's nominal lead. She checked her charge pack methodically, detonators aligned, breaching tool secured to her webbing, the movements drawing no comment from her partners. Ellis shifted beside her, his earlier smirk replaced by a wary glance, the memory of the shed spill still fresh. "Right, let's not cock this up," Tate muttered, clipping his radio to his shoulder. The hierarchy asserted itself in the lineup, Tate calling the shots, Elena and Ellis as the entry pair, the Mercian bringing rear cover. Wilkins's whistle pierced the air, and the first teams moved out, the muffled thuds of simulated blasts echoing across the range. Elena's group waited in tense readiness, the cold seeping through her gloves as she gripped the frame charge. When their turn came, Tate signaled forward, and they advanced in low crouch, boots crunching softly on the gravel. At the mock door, a reinforced slab of timber hinged to a frame. Elena positioned the charge with steady hands, peeling the adhesive backing and pressing it flush. "Set," she said quietly, stepping back as Tate initiated the sequence. The blast was controlled, a sharp crack that splintered the air without true force, the door swinging inward on hinges. Ellis surged first, as planned, sweeping left with his SA-80, but his arc was wide, hesitating at the threshold. Elena followed seamlessly, pivoting right, her rifle tracking the simulated threats, mannequins shrouded in netting within the dim interior. "Clear," she called, her voice level, securing the far corner while Tate and the corporal fanned in behind. The room was theirs in under 10 seconds. The objective? A tagged package on a central table, retrieved without hitch. They emerged to reset, the team breathing evenly in the aftermath. Tate nodded curtly. Clean enough. But as they fell back to the line, Ellis's boot caught deliberately on a loose cable snaking from the doorframe, a remnant of the previous run, sending him stumbling into Elena's path. She sidestepped instinctively, but his elbow clipped her arm, jarring the breaching tool from her webbing. It clattered to the ground, the metal ringing against stone, drawing eyes from across the range. Laughter erupted from the Mercians' cluster, Jenkins's voice cutting through. "Again? Hargrove, you're a jinx on this lot!" Ellis straightened, rubbing his arm with feigned apology. "Sloppy footing, my fault, but come on. Lance Corporal, watch your gear." The barbs landed like rain on the parade square, the unit's attention shifting as whispers spread. Tate snorted, shaking his head. "Support birds and their kit. Pick it up, Hargrove. We've got rotations." Eleanor knelt without retort, retrieving the tool, its handle scuffed but intact, and resecured it. Her fingers steady despite the flush creeping beneath her collar. The humiliation was public now, amplified by the range's open expanse, the hierarchy's weight pressing down, a lance corporal enduring the private slights under the gaze of superiors. From the control point, Captain Harlan watched with folded arms, his expression one of mild impatience. Wilkins paced the line, his intervention limited to a sharp glance at Ellis, but the damage rippled outward, the SAS observer's stillness unbroken. As the next team prepared, Major Kane descended from the platform, his boots silent on the gravel, until he stood at the formation's edge. The unit stilled subtly, ranks straightening under his unhurried approach. He addressed Wilkins first, voice low and measured. "A word on integration." The sergeant major nodded, stepping aside, but Kane's gaze swept the line, settling on Elena as she rose from her kneel, the breaching tool now holstered. She met his eyes briefly, posture rigid, chin level, before looking forward. Kane moved closer, halting beside Captain Harlan. "Captain," he said evenly, "your Mercians are sharp, but let's ensure the full team's synced." Harlan saluted crisply. "Understood, Major. Any specifics?" Kane's response was deliberate, his tone carrying just enough volume for the nearest ranks to hear, the words falling like stones into still water. "Discipline in the breach. It's not just about the entry. It's the ones holding the line behind who turn the tide." He paused, then turned fully toward Eleanor, his posture shifting to one of quiet attention. The range fell into a deeper hush, boots ceasing their shuffle, eyes drawn inexorably. Kane extended a hand, not in command, but in a gesture that bridged ranks without fanfare. "Lance Corporal Hargrove," he said, his voice clear now, laced with the burr of authority earned in shadows. A moment. She stepped forward, the formation parting like mist, her boots echoing softly. Harlan's brow furrowed, confusion etching his features as Kane continued, his gaze unwavering. "That mark on your arm. Seen it before. Continuation course. 15. You were attached to Trojan. Intel feed. During the extract from the Hindu Kush. Pulled the plug on that ambush, fed us the grid before it went kinetic. Saved my team's hides when the SAT link flatlined." The words hung in the chill air, precise and unadorned, revealing the hidden thread. Elena's classified secondment years prior, when she'd manned a forward listening post, her quiet analysis averting disaster for an SAS patrol pinned under fire. No drama in Kane's recounting, just fact, delivered with the restraint of a debrief. The tattoo, glimpsed the night before, was no idle ink. It was the regiment's subtle sigil, awarded post-mission to those who'd bridged worlds without seeking credit. Harlan froze, his arms unfolding slowly, the casual order from the storehouse echoing back like a misfired round. Ellis's smirk evaporated, his face paling as the implications sank in. Whispers died entirely, the unit transfixed. Privates shifting uncomfortably, Tate's eyes widening, Wilkins standing sentinel with a nod of vindication. Kane raised his hand not to her wrist, but in salute, crisp, formal, the winged dagger on his beret catching the weak light. "Well done, then. "And now," he said simply, holding the position until she returned it, her own salute mirroring his precision. The base seemed to hold its breath, the rigid hierarchy fracturing in that suspended moment, not with shouts or spectacle, but with the weight of unspoken respect. Shame rippled through the Mercians, Harlan's posture stiffening as realization dawned. The girl he'd dismissed was a linchpin in operations that defined the regiment. Elena stood unmoving, her expression reserved, the internal tide of vindication cool and contained, expressed only in the steady set of her shoulders. Kane turned to Harlan, his voice resuming its even cadence. "Carry on, Captain. Full integration from here." The Major stepped back to the platform, his team following in silent accord, their stillness now laced with deference toward her. The exercise resumed, but the rhythm had shifted irrevocably, the mockery evaporated, replaced by glances of quiet reassessment. Elena rejoined the line, her place no longer peripheral, the public reckoning etching itself into the base's unyielding stone. As the blasts resumed, distant and methodical, the cold air carried a subtle thaw, the observer's revelation transforming the morning's tension into something enduring. In sterling lines, honor was claimed not in words, but in the salute that bridged the silence, a testament to the moral courage woven into British restraint. The breaching range at Sterling Lines hummed with renewed focus as the joint exercise pressed on, the sharp cracks of simulated charges punctuating the crisp morning air. Lance Corporal Elena Hargrove rejoined her team at the reset point, her boots settling into the gravel with the same unhurried precision that had marked her movements all morning. The revelation from Major Kane lingered like the faint echo of rotor blades, unspoken yet palpable, rippling through the formation in subtle shifts. A private's averted gaze, a Mercian's straightened posture. Captain Harlan stood at the edge of the line, his arms no longer folded but held loosely at his sides, his expression a mask of composed reflection. The hierarchy, so rigidly etched moments before, now bore the faint imprint of reassessment, the air thick with the scent of cordite and damp earth. Wilkins called the next rotation forward, his voice steady as ever, but his eyes carried a new weight when they passed over Eleanor, a nod, almost imperceptible, that acknowledged the undercurrents now surfacing. She took her position without flourish, checking the charge pack once more, her fingers gliding over the components with the quiet competence that had always defined her. Ellis, paired beside her again, kept his distance this time, his earlier smirk replaced by a rigid focus on his own kit. No words passed between them. In the regiment's code, apologies were earned through action, not uttered in haste. The team advanced on signal, breaching the mock door with mechanical efficiency, Elena securing the flank, her rifle tracking shadows in the dim interior, the objective claimed in seconds flat. From the control platform, Kane observed with his team, their stillness unbroken but laced with a subtle deference. Reed, the lance corporal who'd glimpsed her tattoo the night before, stood a fraction closer to the rail, his gaze following her form through the exercise. No exclamations, no gestures of overt praise. The SAS way was restraint, respect shown in the measured tilt of a head or the absence of doubt in a shared glance. As the team emerged, Kane descended once more, this time halting the full formation with a raised hand. The unit stilled, boots grinding to a halt on the gravel, the wind whispering through the heather as all eyes turned to him. "Lance Corporal Hargrove," Kane said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had commanded in silences deeper than this. He stepped forward, not to the center of the line, but directly before her, his posture at attention, beret level, shoulders squared, the winged dagger emblem catching the muted light. "Trojan 2, he added, the old call sign slipping out like a key turning in a long-locked door. It was the designation she'd held during that Hindu Kush extract, a shadow identity known only to those who'd been in the wire with her, feeding intel from a concealed post while the patrol fought for daylight. The words evoked no drama, just the raw fact of her contribution. Grids relayed under fire, a lifeline that had pulled Kane's unit from encirclement when comms failed, and the mountains closed in. Elena met his gaze, her own salute crisp, and returned without hesitation, the exchange a bridge across ranks forged in shared peril. The base froze in that instant, the parade of Mercians rigid, privates like Jenkins shifting weight uncomfortably, their earlier barbs now ashes in the chill air. Harlan moved closer, his face paling as the call sign's weight settled. The casual step-aside girl from the storehouse echoed back, a misstep in judgment that now underscored his own underestimation. Shame spread not in shouts, but in the subtle droop of shoulders, the averted eyes among the Mercians, Ellis staring at his boots, Tate's grunt silenced mid-breath. Wilkins stood sentinel at the flank, his nod deeper this time, a silent ratification of the moral courage that had endured mockery without fracture. Kane held the salute a beat longer, then lowered his hand, turning to address the formation with measured evenness. The regiment thrives on the unseen hands, the ones who hold the line from the shadows. Hargrove's work in 15 reminds us, integration isn't just drills, it's trust earned in the dark. His words were clipped, devoid of embellishment, yet they carried the transformative force of institutional acknowledgement, the kind that reshaped perceptions without fanfare. Harlan saluted in turn, his posture aligning with Kane's, the gesture extending implicitly to Elena, a reform in the moment, the rigid hierarchy bending to honor quiet dignity. "Understood, Major," Harlan replied, his Welsh lilt steadier now, laced with resolve. "We'll adjust the pairings accordingly, full respect across the board." The unit absorbed it in silence, the cold air seeming to thicken with the shift, respect rising like mist from the dew-kissed ground, whispers of admiration threading through the ranks where derision had once held sway. No one mocked her now. The spilled kit from the shed, the jibes in the mess, dissolved into the ether of lessons learned. Eleanor resumed her place, the breaching tool secure at her side, her internal reserve unbroken, vindication expressed not in triumph, but in the steady rise of her chin, the subtle ease in her stride. Kane returned to the platform, his team falling in behind, their observation now one of quiet alliance, the detachment's presence a bulwark against any lingering doubt. As the exercise continued into the afternoon, the rhythm evolved, teams integrating seamlessly, Harlan directing his Mercians with renewed precision, ensuring Elena's input on intel protocols was sought without prompt. Wilkins oversaw it all, his briefings incorporating nods to "support's edge," the phrase a subtle nod to her hidden legacy. The range's scars, pockmarked doors and scattered casings, mirrored the base's own transformation, the public revelation etching respect into the stone of sterling lines. In the unyielding British military ethos, such moments were rare, transformative not through spectacle but through the salute that affirmed silent honor, binding the chain of command anew. By midday, as the sun pierced the overcast in fleeting shafts, the unit broke for a brief stand-easy, mugs of tea passed around under the eaves of the control hut. Harlan approached Elena directly for the first time that day, his stance formal yet devoid of condescension. "Lance Corporal, your input on the next run, appreciated," she nodded, outlining a minor adjustment to the entry sequence, her voice level and professional. He listened without interruption, the exchange a quiet reform, the injustice of the morning's humiliations yielding to mutual regard. Across the range, Kane watched from afar, his expression one of satisfied stillness, the observer's role complete in catalyzing the change. The afternoon drills unfolded with heightened discipline, the Mercians sinking tighter with the SAS cadre, Ellis volunteering for rear cover without a trace of reluctance. Shame had given way to emulation, the base's atmosphere charged with a reserved energy, the kind that forged legends in whispers rather than roars. Elena moved through it all, her past no longer a shadow, but a foundation, the tattoo on her arm a silent testament to the moral courage that had bridged worlds. In the cold clarity of Hereford's hills, respect rose not as a wave, but as the steady climb of disciplined ranks, honoring the quiet professionalism that defined them. If this story already has your respect, hit the like button. It helps the story of Elena Hargrove reach those who still believe in honor. The days following the revelation on the breaching range unfolded with the unhurried precision of Sterling Line's routines, the Herefordshire mist clinging to the paths, like a veil drawn over yesterday's tensions. Lance Corporal Elena Hargrove rose at the familiar 0530 reveille, the barrack stirring with the soft clatter of kit being stowed and boots laced against the chill. The air carried the crisp bite of autumn, mingled with the faint, comforting aroma of fresh brewed tea from the cookhouse, a ritual that anchored the base's rhythm regardless of the shifts beneath the surface. She moved through her morning checks, rifle oiled, webbing aligned. With the same quiet efficiency, her tattoo now a concealed emblem rather than a hidden secret, its significance woven into the unspoken fabric of the regiment. The parade square gleamed under a weak sun, puddles from the night's drizzle reflecting the low clouds as the unit fell in for roll call. Sergeant Major Wilkins's voice cut through the formation, steady and authoritative. "Hargrove." Her response was crisp. "Here, Sergeant Major," and the ranks held their alignment without the sidelong glances that had once trailed her. Private Ellis stood 2 files over, his posture rigid, eyes fixed forward on the horizon where the break-on beacons faded into haze. No smirk marred his features. Instead, a subtle deference marked his stance. The memory of his staged stumble etched as a lesson in restraint. The Mercians, integrated fully now, mirrored the change. Jenkins nodding politely as they passed Kit during equipment distribution, his earlier barbs silenced by the weight of Kane's words. Captain Harlan led the morning briefing from the muster point, his Welsh lilt measured as he outlined the week's cross-training escalation, night navigation exercises on the hills, followed by a full-spectrum simulation incorporating intel feeds. His gaze swept the line evenly, pausing on Elena without the flicker of dismissal that had colored it before. "Lance Corporal Hargrove, your input on the SAT-Link protocols," briefed the teams post-muster. The order was delivered without fanfare, a natural extension of command, yet it carried the reform of institutional respect. Her role no longer peripheral but integral, the hidden past elevating her competence from assumed to affirmed. She inclined her head. "Understood, sir," her voice level, betraying none of the internal steadiness that had weathered the mockery. As the formation broke, the base pulsed with its ordered cadence, boots echoing on the gravel paths, the distant thump of a Land Rover traversing the perimeter. In the ops room, a low-ceilinged space lined with maps and flickering monitors, Eleanor gathered the assault teams for the briefing. The room hummed with the soft whir of ventilation, the scent of marker ink and stale coffee grounding the air. Tate, the former storeman whose chuckles had once punctuated her days, now leaned against a table with arms folded, listening intently as she outlined grid relays and fallback signals. "Key is redundancy," she explained, her tone clipped and professional, tracing lines on the tactical board. "One feed drops, the secondary holds. Lessons from the wire." No one interrupted. Reed from Kane's detachment nodded from the rear, his scarred jaw set in quiet approval. The SAS observer's presence a subtle endorsement. Whispers had changed their tenor overnight, threading through the mess hall like smoke from a suppressed fire. At midday, as soldiers queued for the staple of roast beef and Yorkshire puddings, the conversations shifted from jibes to murmurs of quiet regard. Heard she pulled Trojan out of the cush, grids like clockwork. Ellis confided to a fellow Mercian, his voice pitched low, not for derision but admiration earned in hindsight. Jenkins, passing Elena's bench with his tray, offered a fractional nod. "Solid brief this morning, Lance Corporal," before taking his seat, the gesture small but transformative in the hierarchy's rigid lines. No one grabbed sleeves or dropped trays. The public humiliations of the shed and range had dissolved, replaced by deference expressed in posture. Back straightened, eyes meeting hers with the steady gaze of peers rather than superiors. Major Kane's detachment lingered through the week, their rotations overlapping the exercises with minimal intrusion, their stillness a constant, watchful thread. During the night navigation drill, as teams plotted courses under the starless sky, Kane fell in briefly with Elena's group, his torch beam cutting the darkness without flourish. "Trojan 2's routes held true last time," he murmured during a halt, the call sign a private bridge across the years. She responded with coordinates, her compass steady in gloved hands, the cold air nipping at exposed skin. His nod was deep, unspoken respect flowing in the shared silence, the hill's contours mirroring the quiet dignity that now defined her place. From the officers' mess to the privates' bunks, Eleanor became a quiet legend, not proclaimed in toasts or tales, but in the subtle realignments of base life. Harlan sought her counsel on integration logistics, his orders now laced with collaboration. Hargrove, run the sim with the Mercians, your edge on the feeds. Wilkins incorporated her into advanced briefings, his gravelly affirmations. Spot on, a rarity that spoke volumes. The tattoo, glimpsed only by those who knew, symbolized more than ink, a mark of moral courage that had endured injustice without fracture, emerging to reforge the chain of command. Evenings brought the deepest transformation, the barrack settling into hush as lamps dimmed and the wind sighed through the eaves. Elena sat on her bunk, reviewing logs by the glow of a desk light, the ache in her wrist long faded, but the lesson enduring. No mockery echoed in the corridors. Instead, a respectful distance grew, privates deferring to her path, non-coms exchanging nods of solidarity. The regiment's ethos, quiet professionalism amid rigid hierarchy, had absorbed her story, turning whispers of doubt into echoes of honor. In the end, Sterling Line stood as it always had, boots striking the drill square at dawn, the cold Hereford rain washing clean the paths of Assumption. Elena Hargrove's legacy was no grand monument, but a subtle shift in the unyielding British discipline, a reminder that silent honor, forged in shadows and revealed in restraint, bound the ranks more surely than any order. It was the way of the service, endurance yielding to respect, the moral courage of one reshaping the whole, carried forward in the steady march under the relentless sky. Weeks turned into the steady cadence of winter at Sterling Lines, the Herefordshire hills cloaked in a frost that crunched under boot heels during early patrols. Lance Corporal Elena Hargrove navigated the base's routines with the same reserved poise that had always been her hallmark, her days now threaded with a quiet acknowledgement that permeated the ranks without fanfare. The cold air bit sharper in the mornings, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the distant farms and the metallic tang of frost on rifle barrels during weapon drills. She rose before réveillé, as was her habit, folding her blanket with precise creases and reviewing the previous day's logs by the dim light filtering through the barracks window. The mark on her inner arm, that subtle dagger inked in the aftermath of the Hindu Kush operation, remained concealed beneath her uniform sleeve, a private emblem of endurance, no longer shadowed by doubt. The parade square, its surface etched with the faint scars of countless inspections, hosted the morning muster under a sky heavy with impending snow. Sergeant Major Wilkins's voice rang out with unyielding clarity. Fall in. Smartly now. The formation assembled in crisp lines, privates at the fore, lance corporals like Elena a measured step behind, the hierarchy as rigid as the frozen ground beneath them. Captain Harlan stood at the officer's flank, his posture impeccable, the Welsh precision in his commands now laced with an undercurrent of collaboration forged in the wake of revelation. Hargrove, take point on the perimeter check, he directed during the briefing, his tone even, devoid of the casual diminutive that had once slipped unbidden. She saluted crisply, understood, sir, and moved out with her detail, the weight of her SA-80. A familiar anchor against the chill wind sweeping from the beacons. Private Ellis, assigned to her team for the patrol, fell in without the lingering wariness of weeks past. His boots matched her stride on the gravel path encircling the base, the crunch of frost punctuating their silence. No words of apology passed between them. In the regiment's ethos, such gestures were superfluous, redemption claimed through deeds alone. Grid's clear to the east fence, Ellis reported at the halfway mark, his voice pitched low and professional, eyes scanning the tree line with the focus of one who had learned the cost of complacency. Elena nodded, adjusting her binoculars to sweep the horizon, her observation sharp and unhurried. The patrol completed without incident, their return to the muster point marked by Wilkins's approving glance, a subtle tilt of the head that spoke volumes in the economy of British military affirmation. In the mess hall at midday, the air warmed with the steam of vegetable soup and the low hum of conversation among the benches. Ranks mingled as protocol allowed, but the undercurrents had shifted irrevocably. Corporal Tate, once quick with a condescending grunt, now slid a spare mug of tea across the formica toward her during the queue. "Steady hand on those feeds, Lance Corporal," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with the steady gaze of a peer rather than a superior. She accepted it with a fractional nod, the hot liquid grounding her against the internal reserve that had carried her through the humiliations of spilled kit and staged stumbles. Private Jenkins, seated nearby with his Mercian mates, contributed to the talk of upcoming exercises without the barbs that had once defined his chatter. "Heard the night nav last week was textbook. Trojan's roots, yeah?" one murmured. The call sign invoked not in jest, but in hushed respect, the group's attention turning to Elena with nods of quiet solidarity. Major Kane's detachment had rotated out days after the breaching range, their Chinook lifting off into the mist with the same unassuming grace as their arrival. Yet their influence lingered in the base's transformed rhythm. Briefings now incorporated intel protocols drawn from shadowed operations, Elena's insights sought without prompt. During an afternoon session in the training sheds, the air thick with the scent of canvas and oiled barriers, she demonstrated a transition drill to a mixed group of Mercians and support cadre. "Flank secure before entry. Redundancy saves the line," she instructed. Her movements fluid, rifle sweeping the mock room with economical precision. Harlan observed from the doorway, arms at ease, his input additive rather than overriding. "Build on that for the sim. Captain's compliments." The hierarchy bent but did not break. Respect rising through the chain like frost yielding to dawn. Institutional reform etched in the subtle deference of orders given and received. Evenings brought the deepest hush to Sterling lines, the barracks blocks glowing faintly against the encroaching dark, the wind sighing through the eaves like a distant whisper. Elena sat at her bunk, penning entries in the logistics ledger by the light of a single lamp. The pages filled with the meticulous detail that had always been her silent strength. Whispers of her legend threaded the corridors now, not as exaggerated tales, but as measured accounts shared in the non-coms lounge. Pulled the plug on that ambush, grids when it mattered. No one grabbed at sleeves or engineered failures. The public reckoning had cauterized such fractures, leaving a base renewed in its disciplined core. Wilkins passed her door one night, pausing to rap softly on the frame. "Solid work all round, Hargrove," he said, his gravelly tone carrying the weight of endorsement. She rose to attention briefly. "Thank you, Sergeant Major," and he departed with a nod, the exchange a cornerstone in the quiet transformation. Through it all, Eleanor's vulnerability remained internal, expressed in the reserved set of her shoulders during solitary walks along the perimeter, the cold air clearing her thoughts of the past's shadows. The moral tension that had simmered beneath the mockery, endured in silence, observed by those who truly saw, had yielded to a legacy of consequence, her classified ties to the regiment no longer a burden but a bond. In the unyielding world of British military life, where boots echoed on the drill square and rain pattered on wet concrete at dawn, her story became a reflection of the service's essence, quiet professionalism prevailing over injustice, moral courage recognized not in fanfare but in the steady alignment of ranks. Sterling lines endured as it always had, a bastion of restrained honor amid the rolling hills, where the difference between following orders and doing what's right was measured in salutes exchanged under grey skies. Elena Hargrove's path forward was no louder for its revelation, simply surer, her silent dignity a quiet force that reshaped the whole, carried in the clipped tones and unwavering gazes of those who served beside her. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, courage, and justice within the ranks. Thank you for watching the case of Elena Hargrove. See you in the next one.